Immigration is often something people think about through a modern lens. And though the 20th and 21st centuries have seen a sharp increase in the amount of times people from faraway lands come to settle a new one, let us take a look at a group of immigrants who arrived to the Crimean Peninsula during the 15th century. Crimea had actually been a hotspot of immigration for quite some time. It was one of the most important western stops across the longest natural highway in the world, the Eurasian steppe. This region was a flat grassland that extended from Hungary to Manchuria. This region had a similar climate all throughout, and thus new people could easily settle this region. The method of transportation one would need to travel this land quickly and efficiently was by horse, and consequently those who mastered the horse mastered this land. Thus, the first people to rule this land of Crimea were also the first to rule the western half of the Eurasian steppe, an Indo-European group known as the Scythians. The Scythians were a tribal people from Central Asia who had migrated into this area. However, Crimea was also a peninsula located in the heart of the Black Sea, and thus the next people to dominate the land would be those who could master the sea. Enter the Greeks. To them, this was simply another rocky peninsula that they could set up colonies in, and thus the coastal areas of Crimea came to be populated by Greeks. Then came the far-off empires, whose heartlands were just close enough to warrant a full-on invasion of Crimea. The Persians and the Romans, and later the Romans' eastern successor, the Byzantine Empire. This empire managed to barely hold on to Crimea, flip-flopping between Khazaria and the Kievan Rus, until once again a horse-riding people from Central Asia would travel the Eurasian steppe to conquer the peninsula. These people were the Mongols, and the Turkish mercenaries that they employed. This Turco-Mongol horde came to dominate the peninsula, as their empire came to dominate the world, sticking around even after the Mongol Empire fractured into different empires, and the western half became the Golden Horde. This is where the Crimean Tatars finally enter our story, as it is the descendants of these Turco-Mongols that form the Crimean Tatar community of today. These people would rule Crimea until once again seafaring peoples came to claim the peninsula for themselves. These were the Italian city-states of Venice and Genoa, who competed with each other to build colonies. However, the Golden Horde did not appreciate having these Italians steal their ports, and thus they besieged their castles. In one particular battle, they catapulted their own sick soldiers into enemy castles, and thus infected the Italians with this sickness, and when the Italians eventually retreated from Crimea, they brought back this disease, which came to be known as the Black Plague. After a conqueror named Timur destroyed the Golden Horde's armies, the Crimean Tatars saw this as a good time to rebel and created their own state, the Crimean Khanate, in 1441. Unfortunately for this new state, the Italians had come back to reclaim their port cities. So the Crimean Khanate, having recently converted to Islam, appealed to the greatest Islamic power in the land for help against the Italians. This was the Ottoman Empire, who gladly helped the Tatars defend their port cities. However, they stuck around afterward. Eventually, after the Ottomans captured the leader of the Khanate, the Tatars agreed to become a tributary vassal of the Ottoman Empire. Under Ottoman rule, Crimea became a slave port, and the local Tatar population mixed with these slaves, who were from all over the Ottoman Empire, but mostly consisted of captured Russians. Ironically, the Russians would be the ones to capture Crimea from the Ottomans in the Seventh Russo-Turkish War in 1787. This war saw Russia finally claim a warm water port for itself, although this threatened the other great powers of the world, who eventually came to the aid of the Turks in the Crimean War. Unfortunately for the Ottomans, this war happened to drag out and became unpopular in Britain and France. Russia was losing, and as a result decided to sue for peace. All this peace ended up doing, however, was preventing Russia from stationing military bases in the Black Sea, which of course the Russians would never violate. Crimea remained under Russian control for the next 130 years. During this time, many Russians and Ukrainians would move into Crimea and mix with the Tatar population. That was until the Russian Revolution in 1917. The Soviet regime proved to be ruthless in its treatment of the Crimean Tatars. During World War I and II, many Crimean Tatars had viewed the Germans as liberators. Stalin, being the suspicious guy that he is, started suspecting the Tatars of cooperation, and once the war was winding down in 1944, Stalin deported the Tatars to Uzbekistan in an effort to solidify Russian control over its borderlands. Moving hundreds of thousands of people, however, does not go peacefully, especially under a regime that cares very little for its people. It is estimated that up to 100,000 people were killed during the forced train rides and the marches to Uzbekistan. Once Ukraine became independent and the Soviet Union fell, Crimean Tatars were allowed to return to Crimea and now make up 10% of the population. Then 2014 happened, and Russia decided to annex Crimea from Ukraine. Initially, Russia tried to appease the Crimean Tatars by declaring Tatar an official language and having the leader of Tatarstan, a state in Russia populated by Crimean Tatar ancestors, come in and say that Tatar rights would be respected. However, there have been several reports of racial discrimination against the Crimean Tatars since Russian occupation. The struggle of the Crimean Tatars to defend their autonomy and their civil rights will define them going into the future. Thank you guys so much for watching that video, and stay tuned because Balance of Power Part 3 is coming soon.